The laughter started before Alma Draper had even set down her basket, and it came from the porch of the mercantile where the men liked to gather and be cruel because it cost them nothing. She stood in the wide dust of the street at Bishop's Ford, with a board balanced across 2 barrels and a linen cloth folded back off her pies, and she made herself smile at no one in particular, because a woman selling pies to bury her husband could not afford to hear what was being said about her. "There she is," one of them called, loud enough to carry. "The pie widow buries a man by the slice." Another one laughed so hard he had to hold the porch post. "Tell us, Mrs. Draper, is it grief you're baking in, or just short crust?" Alma's hands did not shake, though she willed them not to, and that was most of the battle. She had baked 6 pies in the dark that morning on a stove nearly out of wood, using the last of the good lard and apples that were more windfall than orchard. And each one was worth a real coin, and each coin was a stone toward the debt she owed the undertaker for a plain pine box and a hole in the churchyard ground. Elias had died owing money, the way honest, unlucky men often did, and the town that had shaken his hand when he was living had turned its back on his widow the week he was cold. "Fresh apple and a good dried peach," she said, to the street, to anyone. "A nickel the slice. Baked this morning." Her voice was steady and clear, and it made the men on the porch laugh harder, because there is nothing a certain kind of man finds funnier than dignity in a person he has decided to despise. A rancher's wife crossed to the far boardwalk rather than pass near her. 2 girls whispered behind their hands. Old Pruitt from the feed store looked at the pies with real hunger, and then looked at the porch and thought better of it, and walked on, because in a small town, the good opinion of cruel men is a currency the timid cannot spend against. Marshal Quinn Easton had been watching the whole of it from the shade of the jailhouse awning across the way, one shoulder against the post, his coffee going cold in his hand. He was a spare, quiet man, with a long jaw and gray coming into his temples, and he had learned in 20 years of the work that most trouble did not need a gun so much as it needed a man willing to stand up and be counted where others would not. He had watched Alma Draper set up her board 3 mornings running now. He had watched the town make sport of her 3 mornings running. And this morning, when the man on the porch called out something about how a pretty pie widow might settle her husband's debts other ways if baking failed her, Quinn Easton set his coffee down on the rail with a small, deliberate click, and he cleared his throat, and he stepped down off the boardwalk into the sun. The porch went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when the schoolmaster returns. Quinn crossed the street unhurried, his boots raising small puffs of dust, and he did not stop at Alma's board, but went on past it, and set his shoulder against the mercantile post, not a foot from the man who had done most of the talking, a big florid fellow named Dob Farley, who ran cattle west of town and ran his mouth everywhere. "Say that last part again, Dob," Quinn said, pleasantly enough. "The part about the widow settling debts. Say it slow, so I'm sure I heard it." Dob Farley's grin went uncertain at the edges. "Aw, Marshal, it was only a man's got to have his fun." "A man does," Quinn agreed. "But it seems to me his fun's been coming straight out of a widow's pocket 3 days now, and I've watched grown men who'd tip their hats to her at church stand here and let it happen because you're loud and they're not." He looked slowly along the whole porch, man by man, and every eye that met his slid away. This woman baked in the dark to pay a debt her husband left her, honest work with her own 2 hands, and this town has decided that's a thing to laugh at. Well, the town's wrong, and I'm done watching it be wrong in the middle of my street. Nobody spoke. Somewhere a horse stamped and blew. Quinn turned to the man beside Farley, a clerk who had laughed as loud as any. You had a nickel to spend on tobacco not 10 minutes back. I saw you buy it. Go and buy a slice of that peach pie, and eat it standing here, where everyone can see, and say thank you to the lady, and mean it." He said it without heat, the way a man states a plain fact, and the clerk went red and looked at Farley, and then looked at the marshal's steady gray eyes, and decided, wisely, whom to fear. He crossed to Alma's board. A slice of the peach, ma'am," he mumbled, and put down his nickel. "Please." Alma cut it with hands that had, at last, begun very slightly to tremble, and lifted it onto a square of paper, and said, "Thank you kindly." And the clerk ate it there in the street, and it was good. Anyone could see from his face that it was good, that it was in fact better pie than the man had eaten in a year. And something in the crowd shifted, the way a herd shifts when the led cow turns. Old Pruitt came back from wherever his conscience had driven him, and bought the whole dried peach pie to take home to his wife. The rancher's wife, who had crossed the street, came back across it, and bought 2 slices of the apple, and did not quite meet Alma's eye, but paid an extra dime and said keep it. By the time the sun stood overhead, Alma Draper's board was bare, and her apron pocket was heavy, and Dob Farley and his friends had found urgent business elsewhere, which is the only kind of business men like that ever find when the wind turns against them. Quinn Easton picked his cold coffee up off the mercantile rail, drank it anyway, and walked back to his shade without a word, as though he had done nothing more remarkable than move a stray dog out of the road. Alma walked home that noon with her empty board under her arm, and her heart going in a way she did not trust. Her house sat at the poor end of Bishop's Ford, a 2-room clapboard with a stove that ate more wood than it gave back heat, and she stood in it a long time before she could make herself set to the next day's baking. She had married Elias Draper at 19, full of the certainty young women have that a charming man's promises are the same as a steady man's deeds, and she had learned the difference slowly and expensively across 11 years. She did not hate him for the silver he chased, or the debts he left. She had simply grown, somewhere in those years, from a girl who was cherished into a woman who did the cherishing for 2 and got none back. And she had told herself that was the shape a marriage took, and there was no other. The men on the mercantile porch had only said aloud what she had half come to believe of herself, that a woman alone was a thing to be pitied at best, and used at worst, and never simply respected. And then a spare gray-templed man had set down his coffee and stepped into the sun and called her honest in front of the whole town, and Alma Draper did not know what to do with that, because no one had troubled to defend her worth in more years than she cared to count. She baked past midnight that night, 6 pies again, and if she wept a little into the crimping, it was nobody's business but her own. Dob Farley was not a man to swallow a shaming quietly. 3 mornings on, when he judged the marshal to be away at the county seat, he brought 2 of his hands to loiter at the mercantile and started the old talk up again, louder for having been made to stop. "Well, if it isn't the pie widow," he called. "Marshal's not here to hold your hand today, is he, Mrs. Draper? Reckon the crust'll have to stand on its own." His men laughed on cue. But Quinn Easton was not at the county seat. He had put the word about that he would be, on purpose, to see who in his town would show his true color when he thought no one watched, and he stepped out of the alley beside the mercantile with his thumbs in his belt, unhurried, and Dob Farley's laugh died in his throat like a snuffed candle. "Don't let me stop you, Dob," Quinn said mildly. "You were saying something about the lady's crust. Finish it." He waited. The silence stretched until it was a punishment all its own. "No? Then here's what you'll do instead. You'll buy a pie, the whole apple, not a slice, and you'll pay double for the trouble you've made this good woman. And then you and your 2 shadows will find some honest work to do before I find some for you in my jail. And Dob, the next time I hear that a widow in my town's been made sport of, I won't clear my throat first. Are we plain?" They were plain. Dob Farley paid his silver with a shaking red hand and never troubled Alma Draper again, and word of it went round Bishop's Ford by supper, and after that a person could have set a watch by the town's new courtesy toward the pie widow. He was wrong about that, though, and Alma meant to tell him so. She found him at the jailhouse that evening, with a whole apple pie wrapped in a clean cloth, the best of the next morning's baking saved back, and made a day early on purpose. "I don't take pay for doing my work, Mrs. Draper," he said, standing in the doorway, not reaching for it. "It isn't pay, Marshal," Alma said. "It's a pie. A person can accept a pie from a neighbor without the world ending. My husband used to say a man who won't accept kindness has never learned how to give it, and I've decided to believe he was right about that, even if he was wrong about most everything to do with money." She held it out a little farther. "You stood up in a street full of people who'd sooner you hadn't. The least I can do is see you don't eat supper alone off a tin plate." Something moved behind the Marshal's careful eyes. He took the pie. "There's 2 forks in the drawer," he said gruffly, "if you're of a mind to see it eaten proper." So, they ate pie at the jailhouse table by lamplight, the Marshal and the pie widow, and they talked. She learned he had lost a wife of his own, years back, and a territory away, to a hard winter and a harder fever, and had never taken to the notion of another, because the work he did was no life to ask a woman into. He learned that Elias Draper had been a dreamer who chased silver that was never there, and left his good steady wife to answer for the chasing, and that Alma did not speak ill of him even so, which told Quinn Easton more about the size of her heart than any sermon could. "You could leave," he said. "Folks would understand it. A widow's got no cause to stay where she's been treated so." "I've $30 still owing on that pine box in that grave," Alma said. "I'll not run off from a debt just because the paying of it's been made hard. Elias ran from enough for the both of us." She looked at her hands. "And there's the churchyard. Somebody ought to be near enough to keep the weeds off him. Nobody else will." Quinn Easton looked at her a long moment across the lamplight and did not say what he was thinking, which was that he had not, in all his careful widowed years, met a woman he would sooner keep the weeds off a grave beside. The pies went on selling after that, for the town's mood had turned, and a Marshal's plain word had shamed the timid into remembering their manners. But it was Quinn who mattered, not the town. He took to buying the first slice every morning, standing at her board in full view, so that no man would dare start the old cruelty again. He mended the board so it no longer wanted 2 barrels to hold it. He came in the evenings, with wood for her near-empty box. He'd split it himself, off his own time, and he'd not hear a word about it. And one gray afternoon he walked with her out to the churchyard and stood bareheaded at Elias Draper's plain marker and pulled the weeds from it with his own hands while she watched, because she had said somebody ought to, and he had decided he would be the somebody. "You needn't have," Alma said, her throat tight. "He wasn't yours to tend. He wasn't even much good to me, if I'm to be honest, at a graveside. He gave you 11 years, and then left you to carry them," Quinn said, working a stubborn root loose. "A man can be worth tending for what he left behind him, even when he wasn't worth much for himself. And you loved him once, or you'd not stand here in the cold, worrying over his weeds. That's enough for me." He brushed the dirt from his knees and stood. "Doing a thing you needn't do. That's about the only way left to say a thing a man doesn't have the words for." Winter came down hard on Bishop's Ford that year. The debt was paid by the first snow, $30, coin by coin, slice by slice, until the undertaker made his mark in his book, and Alma Draper walked out of his office, owing no living soul a thing. She had done it herself, with her own 2 hands, and her own straight back, and she was prouder of that ledger line than of anything in her life. But a paid debt is a cold thing to bring home to an empty house, and she stood in her doorway that evening with the snow coming down, and felt, for the first time since Elias died, not shamed, but only lonely, which is a different and more honest ache. There was a knock. Quinn stood on her step with his hat in his hand, and snow on his shoulders, and a look on his long jaw she had not seen before. Not the Marshal's calm, but a plain, frightened hope, the look of a careful man about to be uncareful. "The debt's paid," he said. "The whole town knows it. You could go anywhere now, and I've no right to say a word against it." He turned the hat once. "But I find I can't watch you set up that board another morning and pretend I'm only keeping the peace. I've been keeping you, Alma, in my thoughts, since the first day I heard those fools laugh, and heard you answer them steady. I'm too old and too set, and my work's a poor bargain for any woman. But there's a churchyard needs its weeds kept, and a woodbox I'd sooner fill than any other, and a table with 2 forks in the drawer that's been too quiet for a lot of years. If you'd have a plain man who came to the standing up late, I'd count it the best thing I ever did." Alma Draper, who had faced a jeering street with her chin up and never let it break her, felt her eyes fill at last. Not from cruelty this time, but from being, after so long, truly seen. "Come in out of the snow, Quinn Easton," she said, "before you say something we'll both have to live up to on your doorstep in a blizzard." And she took his cold hand in both of her warm ones, and drew him over her threshold and shut the door on the winter behind him. They married in the small church at Bishop's Ford in the deep of that winter, with old Pruitt standing up for the Marshal, and the rancher's wife weeping in a pew, and the whole town that had once laughed now crowded warm inside to see the Pye widow wed. And on Sunday mornings after, folks grew used to the sight of the Marshal walking out to the churchyard on his wife's arm, the two of them bareheaded at an old plain marker, keeping the weeds off a dreamer's grave, because Alma Draper had never once run from a debt or a duty in her life, and Quinn Easton had found, at long last, a woman worth standing up for, and a home worth being late to, and a table that would never be too quiet again.